Hello and welcome to my session on COVID-19's effects on sport marketing. My name is Dr. Brian Turner. I'm a professor at The Ohio State University, and it's quite an honor to be one of the speakers at this conference. I'm going to start with some background on COVID and then get into how it specifically affected sport. On March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus a pandemic. Just a couple of days before that, though, Rudy Gobert from the Utah Jazz was at a press conference and touched out every microphone there in front of him. 2 days later, he was diagnosed with COVID. And as you can see there in the bottom right, their game in Oklahoma City was canceled. And it was because he tested positive for COVID. There's the NBA's official announcement, the NBA to suspend season following tonight's game, those games on March 11th. This came out at 9:31 p.m. on the 11th, a Wednesday. So the next day, March 12th, is the day the sports world stopped. This is a headline from the New York Post the following day on Friday. And just to give you kind of a timeline, it's pretty interesting how quickly this all happened. At just after midnight, the NBA G League suspended the rest of their 2019-2020 season. The G League is the developmental league for the NBA. FIBA suspended all competitions indefinitely at 5:24 a.m. that morning. La Liga postponed match days 28 and 29 at 7:30. Followed by the ATP suspending all tournaments until at least the week of April 20th, so about a month. The MLS suspended its 2020 season for at least 30 days, followed shortly by U.S. Soccer. They canceled matches for the men's and women's national teams in March and April. 136, the NHL was the next of the major sports to suspend activity, followed a couple of hours later by Major League Baseball. They canceled spring training games and pushed back the start of the 2020 regular season by at least 2 weeks. Also on this day, for those in the U.S., you know, March is the heart of college basketball, March Madness. And so this was a week of most of the conference tournaments. At 11:45 that morning, the Big Ten canceled the remaining part of their tournament. They had gotten a couple of games in the night before. The American Athletic Conference canceled its men's basketball tournament at 11:47, 2 minutes later, followed at the same time as the Southeast Conference. They canceled the remainder of its men's basketball tournament. About 30 minutes later, the ACC canceled the remainder of their tournament. A couple minutes later, the Pac-12 canceled their tournament. Followed by the Big 12, canceling both the men's and women's tournaments. And finally, the Big East at 1:09 canceled their tournament. So you can see within a very short time frame, all of the major conferences canceled their tournaments. But the big announcement happened at 4:16. A few hours later, the NCAA canceled all the remaining winter and spring championships, including the men's and women's basketball tournaments. So a huge day, March 12th. In Ohio, it also canceled the girls' basketball state tournament. There was a team that was on the court ready to play, and they got pulled because the remainder of the tournament was canceled. A few weeks later, March 30th, the big announcement came that the Tokyo 2020 games were going to be postponed for a year until July 23rd through August 8th, 2021. And then in July, the NBA restarted, but in a bubble in Orlando at Walt Disney World. So no fans, but you see on the right, there were virtual fans. If you watched any of those games, you saw people cheering, but there were no actual fans for the remainder of the NBA season. Similarly, the WNBA had a bubble they affectionately called the Wubble at IMG Academy at Bradenton, Florida. Again, no fans, and you can kind of see on the bench the benches that the players and coaches are spread out. So they were socially distanced. Starting August 1st, the NHL had their version of the bubble in 2 sites, Edmonton and Toronto. So you can again see absolutely no fans, but they were able to finish out their season. So that got us through the summer, but then in the fall in the US, football is a priority. And starting with college football, you can see some of the attendance policies. Originally, the Big 10 and the Pac-12 said they were not going to play a football season. A few weeks after that announcement, they decided to have an abbreviated schedule starting in October. But you can see the policies for each of the leagues, and a lot depended on local regulations. So in the ACC, some schools were not allowed to have any fans, and some had up to a 25% capacity. Same thing with the Big 12. With the Big 10, there was no public attendance at games. Only family members of participating players were allowed. And this happened after a couple of weeks with no fans at all. The SEC had a policy from parents and family only to up to a 25% capacity. And then finally, the Pac-12, the last of the Power 5 conferences, had no public attendance at games. Only family members or participating players were allowed, depending on local regulations. There were some cities that did not allow gatherings. So some football games in the Pac-12 had no attendance at all. This is a picture at one of our home games that season at Ohio State. You can see people just in the middle of the field, and they were socially distant. So these were friends and family of players. We did have cardboard cutouts of people. They could pay a nominal fee and get their picture inside the stadium on a cardboard. So it made it look like there were some fans. And in fact, I had my own cardboard cutout that was at each of the games. While I wasn't able to attend in person, my cardboard cutout was there at all the home games. For the NFL, the most powerful league in sports, 13 of the 32 teams did not allow fans at all. So you can see the attendance in 2020 was only a little over 1 million, whereas this past season, where most teams were at full capacity, there was up to over 18 million fans attending NFL games. The Cowboys averaged around 28,000 fans that season, but no other team averaged more than 20,000. I did attend a game during the pandemic 2020. This was late in the season, a game between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Dallas Cowboys. You might say, well, this is before the game starts. No, this was at kickoff. And so you can see a very limited number of fans, and they were all socially distanced. Seats were tied down where you couldn't sit in them. So they only sold tickets in a socially distanced manner. Super Bowl that year, Super Bowl LV, was in Tampa, Florida, between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Kansas City Chiefs. Tampa Bay won in their home stadium, but there were only 25,000 fans allowed at the Super Bowl. They also had 30,000 cutouts at the game to make it look more crowded. So if you count both, about 55,000 seats were occupied. The remainder of this session, I want to talk about the effect COVID-19 had on sport, and specifically sport marketing. First and foremost was, with no or limited number of fans, there was limited ticket revenue. So there were no tickets to sell. This was one of our men's basketball games. At this point, it was no fans at all. Later added family and friends, but you can see big arena with no fans. You can kind of see on the benches too, the players and coaches were all socially distant. So they weren't sitting side by side like they typically were in a normal season. So no fans, or no or limited fans, equaled limited ticket revenue. At Ohio State, I'm on our athletic council. In fiscal year 2021, which went from July 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2021, we had a $63.6 million deficit. And almost all of this can be attributed to the lack of football ticket revenue. So in 2019, the year prior to the pandemic, we generated about $56.6 million in ticket revenue. In 2020, this number dropped to 25,614. And this can be attributed to visiting fans coming to the stadium. They still paid for tickets for our visiting fans. So you can see about a $56 million drop in revenue. Second area is employment, and this is from Teamwork Online. Teamwork Online is a job board for all of our major professional leagues in many colleges and smaller sport organizations. So you can see about 1,700 job postings the quarter prior to the pandemic, and this dropped to 436. And honestly, I'm surprised it's even that high. You can see a very slow increase in the third quarter of 2020, and definitely an increase in the first quarter of 2021, but we're still in the pandemic and still limited positions in sport. So we still are nowhere near pre-COVID employment. This is an interesting stat I saw. The U.S. sports occupations are losing up to 92,000 in earnings a minute during the shutdown. And this was right after COVID happened in April and May. I believe this survey was done. So quite a bit of occupations losing money during the shutdown. This is from a study that talked about employment before COVID and during COVID. And you can see before COVID, about 35.5% of the jobs were in sales. This number dropped significantly because there wasn't nothing to sell, primarily tickets. There were no tickets to sell to games. So you can see the number in sales dropped significantly. Second area was marketing. Again, there's no games to really market to fans, so those departments shrunk. Those two areas being the primary, a few others during the pandemic shrunk. One of the hardest hit were temporary workers, such as those that work in concession stands. Now, Major League Baseball has 81 home games where they need workers at concession stands, and there were very limited, if any, opportunities there. You know, the NBA, the NHL shut down, and so no concessions at any of those arenas. And a lot of these workers are using it as a second job to have added income. So it really affected those working in concession stands. That kind of leads to my ultimate question. Will fans return to levels that we saw prior to the pandemic? Well, before going on, people found it easy to watch games on TV. Are they going to come back or just continue watching games on TV? Also, you know, when you were going quite a while with no live sports, some might have found other activities that they enjoyed just as much. So that question of will fans return, we don't know the answer to that just yet. We are getting some indication, though, with college football. You can see no attendance figures for 2020 because some places had zero attendance, some had friends and family. At most, they were up to about 25% capacity in 2020. So none of the NCAA schools reported their average attendance, or the NCAA didn't report average attendance in 2020. But you can see over a 6% drop in attendance from 2019 to 2021. And this number in 2021, 38,775, this is the lowest attendance in 40 years that has been reported by the NCAA. Now, you can definitely see a downward trend of the last decade or so, but that was a pretty significant drop in 2020 from 2019 to 2021. So we'll have to monitor that for 2022 to see if we're continue going down or we rebound a little bit. And these figures uh, were across all 5 of the Power 5 conferences. The Big Ten and SEC saw a pretty minimal drop in average attendance, just a few hundred, but the other 3 saw anywhere from 2,500 to over almost 4,000 in drop. So definitely have to keep an eye on college football attendance. Same thing with the NFL. But that leads us to the future. What did maybe we learn from the pandemic, or what maybe accelerated some current trends? And I think one that we're all familiar with is Zoom. The option to work from home for some positions in sport is definitely viable. Workers don't necessarily have to be in a physical location to be able to do their job. And we can also meet with a wider range of individuals. We can have Zoom meetings with people from across the world in one location. Definitely a trend that we've seen in sports is the idea of mobile ticketing. Instead of having hard tickets or having the option to print your tickets at home and scan them when you get there, many sport organizations have gone to kiosks similar to the one there on the right. I went to several sporting events over the last year, and they all had some form of this mobile ticketing, no hard tickets. So people aren't scanning your tickets necessarily for you. You can do it on your own at a kiosk, so there's very little contact. An example on there on the left is my ticket to our men's basketball game coming up here on March 3rd. I'll just take my cell phone, take it to the kiosk like the one in the right, and I'll gain entry. Similarly, many sport organizations, and say a majority, have gone to card and mobile payment only, no cash. So there's no transaction, workers making change, coming in more contact with individuals. So a lot have gone to credit card only at concession stands, souvenir shops, and at Ohio State, we even have this with our parking. You can't pay cash for parking. Well, I want to end by saying if we've learned anything from the pandemic, it is to have multiple backup plans. No one could have predicted this pandemic, but we have to have a plan in place for just in case something stops us from playing our games. I focus primarily on pro and college sport, but this happens even at the high school level. At my local high school, they had a friends and family policy only where individual players, I believe, had 2 tickets to the game to see basketball, for example. But what they did is start live streaming games on YouTube. And they've continued that this past year, even when they were allowed more fans. So getting more exposure, another way to view high school games. High schools have also gone to the mobile ticketing. Again, at my local high school, you couldn't buy tickets at the door or the gate. You had to pre-purchase them online and show them your mobile ticket on your cell phone. Well, that ends my presentation on COVID-19's effects on sport marketing. I really appreciate all those in attendance. I wish we could be in person and have live question and answers, but please feel free to email me at turner.409@osu.edu. Again, my name is Brian Turner. I'm a professor of sport management at The Ohio State University. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the conference.